Okay, great. We should be live. So I'm very excited today to be able to introduce a couple different speakers for our first Radical Philosophy Hour in a very long time. We're relaunching after a hiatus. And sorry, I had my own voice broadcasting back at me. I'm back now. That we're all good. All right, so I'm so happy to be able to introduce Oche Onazi, who will be speaking to us today about his work on decolonization and disability justice. Let me read for you his bio. Oche is a senior lecturer in law at the University of Northumbria. Oche was also an International Social Research Foundation Early Career Fellow. He holds degrees from the Universities of Edinburgh, Warwick, and Jos-Nigeria, and is a qualified but not practicing barrister and solicitor of the Supreme Court of Nigeria. Oche's research interests cover areas of legal philosophy, law and development, and human rights. He is the author of An African Path to Disability Justice, Community Relationships and Obligations, Human Rights from Community, a rights-based approach to development, and editor of African Legal Theory and Contemporary Problems. Oche is on the editorial boards of the Journal of Philosophy of Disability and Oxford Studies in Disability, Ethics, and Society. And again, today he's presenting Decolonizing Disability Studies, Rethinking Disability Justice through an African Relational Community Ideal. With that, I'll turn it over to Oche.
Thank you, Brandon, for that very kind introduction. And also thank you all for giving me the opportunity to discuss some aspects of my research with you. I look forward to benefiting from your insights, comments, and questions. Given that we tend to mean different things when we speak about decolonization, I will start by briefly reflecting on what I mean by the term and consider its relevance to disability justice. I'll then go on to discuss the African relational community ideal and consider what a decolonized concept of disability justice looks like from the ideal. In doing so, I'll discuss the strengths and limits of the proposed African approach, as well as how those limitations may be overcome. So let me start with decolonization. Decolonization has not only meant the end of colonialism, but also that political independence is not exhaustive of how we think about colonization. Decolonization captures many forms of exclusion that remain legacies of colonialism today, but also novel exclusions or neo-colonialisms that cannot be reduced to it. In other words, decolonization mediates between the historical fact of colonization and the novel political, economic, social, and cultural forms of domination today. It amplifies the uninterrupted nature of the previous colonial order and logics, which call for renewed projects of decolonization. As a result, decolonization covers a wide range of issues, including epistemological questions about the marginalization or ignorance of Southern knowledge in mainstream Western academic scholarship. Therefore, a core aspect of the literature on decolonization is an attempt to revive or restore the potential of marginalized forms of Southern knowledge. Although epistemological decolonization is generally critical of Western thought, it is not always totally opposed to it or certain versions of it. Rather, it seeks to critically engage with Western thought to reveal, disrupt, denaturalize, and transcend oppressive aspects of forms of Western knowledge. This is in recognition that Southern knowledge itself has not been shielded from colonial or post-colonial influences. So in this sense, it is more promising to consider decolonization as an attempt to expose and undo oppressive structures of both the colonized and colonizer. Although there is some work on epistemological decolonization in disability studies, there are very few examples of what disability studies and its key concepts look like from non-Western scholarly perspectives. It is for this reason that I take disability justice as a point of departure and consider what it would look like from an African relational concept of community. Far from being the only or dominant conception of community in the literature on African philosophy, the relational version is arguably the most inclusive notion. The relational conception of community refers to ethical and horizontal relationships between people who may or may not be its members. Here, the term community does not refer to the property of a group or a metaphysical entity, but refers to a relational ideal created by relationships between people who may or may not comprise it. Thus, the term community is equivalent to human relationships, which are not only fundamental to it, but the primary means of constituting and defining what the concept of community means. In other words, human relationships are the core characteristic of this conception of community, as well as the source of its meaning and other properties. What is novel about this idea of community is certainly its directness, as it neither exists as a metaphysical entity, nor has an existence as either separate or takes precedent over or supersedes the existence of its members. Drusilla Cornell powerfully captures the attractiveness of the relational conception of community by describing it as something that is not outside us, something over there, but is inscribed in us. Cornell importantly calls us to appreciate that human relationships are not only key to the formation of community, but also what it gives it its meaning and fundamental character. In the literature, the Southern African indigenous concept of Ubuntu has arguably been the most authoritative written account of the relational community ideal. Although Ubuntu is notoriously difficult to define, as it has no precise English language translation, it roughly translates into an ethical or normative principle in which individuals constitute and are constituted by community formed by ethical and horizontal interactions between each other. Ubuntu, again, to borrow a phrase from Cornell, refers to an interactive ethic or ontic orientation in which who and how we can be as human beings is always shaped in our interaction with each other. What is attractive and indeed original about Ubuntu is not only that relationships between individuals are what constitutes community, but also that it is the community that in turn constitutes individuals. Accordingly, being a person is not only different and superior to being a human being, but is only achieved through relationships in the form of mutual reciprocal obligations between individuals. Obligations are therefore a central and compelling feature of the relational community ideal, but at the same time, a feature that presents obstacles for people with disabilities. It is specifically the distinction or hierarchy between persons and human beings that presents difficulties for people with disabilities, especially those with cognitive and extreme physical disabilities. It does not necessarily lead to the denial of their status as human beings. Rather, it leads to their inferior status and makes them less worthy of moral consideration. The implication is that those who cannot perform obligations cannot be treated as equals. Their claims are subordinated to that of persons, and they're denied the benefits of community membership. For me, this explains why people with disabilities tend to be missing from the demanding standard of mutual obligations, synonymous with being part of a community in African philosophy. Of course, not only is there a wide variety of disabilities, but they are also so diverse that it makes generalizations difficult. So I'm not suggesting that all people with disabilities would not be able to perform obligations. The ability to perform an obligation would be subject to the kind of disability concerned, especially if this is contingent on social or environmental factors. Regardless of the type of disability, the ability to perform an obligation would also be contingent on the way in which it manifests in concrete or institutional terms. For instance, if the obligation manifests as an active or performative civic duty, such as compulsory military service or community service, this would clearly take for granted the idiosyncrasies of some of the most vulnerable people with disabilities. Therefore, I'm arguing that the possibility of extending obligations to people with disabilities depends on articulating obligations in a way that they reflect the symmetry and not symmetry which dominates the literature in African philosophy. My argument hinges on rethinking the dominant conception of person in a way that recognizes people with disabilities as persons and not simply human beings. A good way of achieving this is to think of personhood along the lines of the conception of person associated with the Inso people of the Cameroons. Unlike the dominant conception of person, such as the one associated with Ubuntu, the Insular conception does not rigidly define individuals or place them into a hard analytic frame by specifying the necessary and sufficient criteria for being human. It makes no distinction between persons and human beings, and it does not rank human beings according to any individuating features, whether it is age, status, or impairment. It is an open-ended or non-essentialist conception of personhood, which accommodates changes in the characteristics of human beings. A further advantage of this conception of person is that it widens the scope of people to whom obligations are owed, since the moral consideration of others is not contingent on any individuating features. Being a human being is the only criterion to be the recipient of the obligation of others. People incapable of reciprocation are owed obligations in the same way as they are owed to people capable of reciprocation. Obligations are therefore enriched and transformed into an asymmetrical concept, given that reciprocation is not a precondition for personhood and moral consideration. With this sort of modification, I suggest that the African philosophical tradition can contribute to understanding an obligation-based approach to disability justice, which seeks to prioritize obligations to people with disabilities owed by people without disabilities. The aim of the approach is to build on the core obligations in the literature on African philosophy, that is, the obligation to help others in distress, the obligation to show concern for the needs and welfare of others, and the obligation not to harm others, so as to mobilize them against injustices suffered by people with disabilities in Africa. Now, the difficulty with this approach is how to translate it into practice. Part of the problem is the general difficulty of applying non-Western indigenous concepts beyond their original and familiar settings. In the case of obligations, they reflect ethical practices that characterize small-scale traditional African societies of the past. So there are hardly any examples or any literature on how to replicate them within the context of modern African nation states. As attractive as these obligations might appear on the surface, they are difficult to institutionalize and command widespread compliance amongst many citizens who can do so. Furthermore, discharging these obligations will depend on the ability to nurture compassionate and altruistic dispositions amongst a wide spectrum of obligation bearers. Although this will depend on the good faith of the obligation bearers, it is difficult to anticipate far-reaching and meaningful conformity with these obligations without the normative and coordinating force of law. Here, law is not proposed conventionally as a coercive instrument, but rather as an ethical guide to human behavior. Therefore, I'm not suggesting that obligation bearers should be legally penalized or sanctioned for failing to help people with disabilities they encounter daily. This, of course, would be impracticable for several reasons, including the difficulty of translating these obligations into concrete laws, as well as enforcing them. Rather, the suggestion is that the ethical force of law can help nurture compassionate dispositions amongst obligation bearers, as well as help pull together or collectivize such obligations in a way that they can be channeled to people with disabilities. In my book, An African Path to Disability Justice, I considered a role for law through tax. Here, the term tax is used as a means through which citizens in a political community share the burdens of living together. And sharing the burdens of living together must imply a collective obligation to care for the sick, elderly, poor, and vulnerable, a majority of which, especially in Africa, are likely to be people with disabilities. Tax is therefore understood as a placeholder of the altruistic obligations of people without disabilities to be generous, benevolent, compassionate, friendly, to help, love, and respect the most vulnerable people with disabilities. Although tax primarily means a moral obligation, it has a legally binding character. Tax without law is an incomplete obligation, unable to command widespread compliance. Therefore, tax is a type of mechanism that can guarantee that the obligations to people with disabilities are binding and stringent on obligation bearers. Tax transforms and translates what are ordinary moral obligations into legally binding commitments to people with disabilities. Tax can be mobilized against disability injustice injustices in several concrete ways, ranging from removing the barriers to sharing and experiencing community life, to supporting the physical, mental, biological needs and social welfare of people with disabilities, as well as enabling them to access public goods and services, especially healthcare services, housing, educational, and employment opportunities. Undoubtedly, tax has its limitations. Tax has a dark colonial history and is vulnerable to corruption in the post-colonial era. It runs the risk of marketizing or reducing such altruistic obligations into hollow, compulsory, or coercive and instrumental monetary payments. Tax is not a perfect institution, but I argue that it provides the best mechanism to collectivize and institutionalize obligations in a way that can have a substantive impact on the lives of people with disabilities. Therefore, in conclusion, I have tried to move beyond decolonized critiques of disability studies to explore what disability justice would look like from an African philosophical perspective. As much as critiques are important in advancing the decolonization agenda, it is equally, if not more important, to understand how Southern concepts or forms of knowledge can transform disability studies and disability justice in particular. Not much has been done in this respect, perhaps because epistemological decolonization is not an easy question. It's not a question of simply identifying and translating non-Western concepts into Western or modern institutional frameworks. The precise mechanism for the practical implementation of non-Western concepts remains challenging for decolonization. I have outlined a few ideas on what might be possible. This has been an exercise in imagination rather than a practical blueprint on how to concretely achieve an obligation-based approach to disability justice in Africa. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Oche. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Jake. Jake?
All right, let me just unmute. Hello, everyone. So I now have the pleasure to be introducing our next speaker. Joel Michael Reynolds is an assistant professor of philosophy and disability studies at Georgetown University, senior research scholar in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics, senior bioethics advisor to and fellow to the Hastings Center, and faculty scholar of the Greenwall Foundation. At Georgetown, they are also core faculty in the Disability Studies program, faculty fellow of the Center for Social Justice, and affiliated faculty in the Medical Humanities Initiative. They are founder of the Journal of Philosophy of Disability and co-founder of the book series Oxford Studies in Disability, Ethics, and Society from Oxford University Press, both of which they co-edit. Current research includes 2 monographs and 2 edited volumes, a multi-year externally funded project from the Greenwall Foundation on the relationship between the concepts of disability and quality of life, and book chapters for philosophical foundations of disability law. The Encyclopedia of Phenomenology, that's got a lot for me to say, and Reclaiming Philosophy as Disability History, Cripping the Canon. They will be presenting The Life Worth Living, Disability, Pain, and Morality. I look forward to hearing it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that introduction. And it's a real honor to be giving this talk today, and especially with Dr. Onazi, whose work I've been following for a number of years, and it's really great. The plan for today is going to be a little bit more off the cuff and conversational. Working on this book, I feel like I worked on it for well over a decade. It's not quite true, but nonetheless, I didn't want to do a formal presentation. I thought I'd just talk it through a bit more. The Life Worth Living, I just forgot the title of my own book, The Life Worth Living, Disability, Pain, and Morality. In many ways, this book, the project arose from the experiences I had with my family and still have with my family. More specifically, the experiences with my brother Jason, who passed away a number of years ago, but who was born with cerebral palsy, muscular dystrophy, hydrocephalus, and the sort of body mind he had meant that all of us were kind of de facto caregivers. And the ways in which he was disabled were quite distinct, not only in general, but quite distinct from the ways in which my mother came to be disabled later in her life, in her early 30s. She is a chronic pain sufferer, has degenerative disc disease, fibromyalgia, TMJ, you name it. And even though both my mother Gail and my brother Jason are on any plausible definition of disability, they're disabled, what that actually meant for them, not only at the level of their daily lives, but what it meant for them politically, what it meant for them interpersonally, what it meant for them socially, was in many ways just wildly different. My mom's disabilities did and still do really negatively impact her well-being. Chronic pain sucks. It's not fun. Jason, on the other hand, the epilepsy definitely caused issues, but he was doing great most of the time. Yes, he required a lot of care, but in many ways, he lived a happier life than a lot of people I have met during my own time on Earth. And yet, the way people would respond to him would often just, they would assume that he was in pain or was suffering. They would assume he needed to be healed in the sense of, I don't know, being able to walk or something like this. And my mom, on the other hand, because all of her disabilities were invisible, people would often assume there was nothing wrong with her. They would be confused why she couldn't do certain things or whatever. It was just a very, very different sort of responses. And yet what was very clear to me from these personal experiences was that in almost every case, people would bring sets of assumptions concerning what it is like to be disabled to bear on how they would interact with Jason and my mom. And the book, the central thesis of the book is that historically, across the Western intellectual tradition, I think it's also true of at least bits and parts of traditions from the Near East and East, though that gets more complicated, and I'm not super competent to talk about that, so I limit myself to the quote-unquote Western intellectual tradition. I argue that disability has been conflated with pain and suffering, or more specifically, that experiences of disability have been assumed to be experiences that necessarily come along with pain and suffering. And as an entry point to that problematic, I just want to actually read the first 3 paragraphs of the book because they say it better than I certainly could say it off the cuff. So here's page 1 of The Life Worth Living. On his deathbed, awaiting the vial of hemlock that would consummate his juried execution by his Athenian peers, Socrates asks, is life worth living with a body that's in a corrupted and in a bad condition? In no way, replies his friend Crito. This judgment will be repeated across cultures, across epochs. The corrupted body, a body many today would call a disabled body, it's so undesirable that one would rather not be than bear its existence. Here, at the canonical origins of the Western intellectual tradition, one finds certainty on Socrates' part, Crito's part, etc. One finds certainty that some forms of life are worth less than others, or worthless, not worth living at all. In the end, the Socratic deathbed hallows an otherworldly set of values. From Plato to Aquinas, from Descartes to Kant and beyond, the life of the body for the Western canon is so often held to be worth less than that of the mind, and the lives of certain bodies and certain minds deemed worth less still. Yet what do the actual conditions of life, the fleshy, enmeshed, messy conditions that forever come to us with a past, present, and a future, what do these tell us? What does the constitutive variability of our bodies, given the types of organisms we are, what does that suggest about how we ought to treat others and the worth of a life? And what are the natural assumptions and reasons that people bring forth when they make determinations and actions based upon those determinations concerning whose life is worth living. This book is an attempt to answer these questions by investigating the claim, investigating the assumption, really, I think it's rarely, if ever, fully defended, investigating the assumption that some lives are simply not worth living. This idea has enjoyed an absolutely astonishing consensus across the history of philosophy, to the point that it functions almost as a kind of foundation for further thought. And yet, the goal of the book is to show why that assumption is fundamentally wrong in general, but also it is especially and particularly wrong when it is applied to disabled experiences. And the architecture of the book, I'm done reading now. The architecture of the book, in some ways, I put as much work into the organization as I did the content, because what I was trying to do is lead a reader who really wants to take this question seriously. Is it true that some lives are not worth living? I wanted to lead them through not only history, not only theory, but also experience using the tools of phenomenology, or I think most people would call what I'm doing critical phenomenology. Lead them to see why it is the case that experiences of disability are distinct from experiences of pain and suffering, but also to understand why that conflation has been made for millennia, and why most people, at least if you grew up in any way like I did, I just kind of assumed that from the get-go. As far back as I remember, you see someone who has a disability of whatever sort, or you yourself are disabled, and there would be an assumption that that comes along with something negative. And I argue that the real punchline of the book doesn't come until chapters 5 and 6. Each chapter can be read on its own, but I think that's a lot more, of a punch if it's read cumulatively. The real punchline of the book is to say that the ultimate issue is not actually mistaken assumptions about disability. The ultimate issue is that the way we think about ability, the way we think about the I can, is more often than not either just absurd, like in the sense of almost nonsensical, cannot be defended, or is a very, very poor, naive kind of understanding of what it means to be able to do something. And I try and use as many examples as I can to kind of drive home this point. It's so natural for people, and this is including professional philosophers, they are people too, to think that the I can, that is a power, in a kind of technical sense of power, maybe it's a disposition, something like this. It is a power that resides in an individual. And the more you investigate that idea, the more you see that that just makes no sense. Think about something like very, very obvious, like breathing. It is easy to think that whether or not a human organism can breathe is a question of that organism's respiratory system, right? And yet the moment we take a step back and think in terms of ecology, think in terms of evolutionary biology, or just a very, very basic kind of ontological approach to that sort of a question, we'll see that that makes no sense. Breathing is a question of a relationship between an organism and an environment that either affords it the ability to do that particular action or not. And although, of course, the individual organism plays a role, and someone can have greater or worse, lung capacity, blah, 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 of course that is determining. What is determinate is at the level of the relationship between these things. To get to that argument and to see why that is the ultimate issue underwriting so much of what I think is true of disability stigma across history, it takes a lot of work, and I do my very best to both play philosopher, intellectual historian, sociologist and moment to try and bring all the kind of theoretical tools to bear I possibly can to see this clearly. But the heart of each of the movements really, again, always comes down to lived experience. I'm a bit of a dyed-in-the-wool phenomenologist in the sense that I think looking to lived experience and trying to understand the general structures of experience provides wildly useful insights when we're trying to understand things. And so, you know, when I talk about disability, there's a full chapter on a phenomenology of disability. There I'm relying upon the work of S.K. Toombs. There's a full chapter on a phenomenology of pain. I'm doing a little bit more kind of original work there, but also drawing on a good bit of literature out there. And then in that sixth and final chapter, maybe it's the fifth, I might have inverted them, try and give a kind of phenomenology of ability, which turns out to be, as I mentioned, a question of relationships and inner animation between organisms and environments, and absolutely not something that is merely a property of individuals. I'll just stop there. We'll call that good. Time for questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
I'm not seeing questions right now on Facebook or on YouTube. Anybody who's out there, of course, and watching, please do feel free to post your questions. So I think maybe Jake and I can lead the way with a few questions of our own. I don't know, Jake, if you want to start us off. I have some in my pocket here that I'm anxious to ask, but I'm more than happy to.
Sure. Well, I mean, I have some for both of you. Let's see. Well, you have questions for both of them as well, right?
Yeah. So maybe I'll go ahead and start us off. So
yeah.
I think, and maybe this will start with Oche, and perhaps it can head into Joel's work from there. But you know, obviously one of the big sort of ethical normative concepts that people work with is autonomy. But I noticed it didn't come out a lot in what you were talking about, but it seems like something that matters a lot within, or would and could matter a lot within what you're discussing. And in particular, then, if I think about this question of relationality and co-constitution between the individual and the community, as well as the necessity of obligation, Oche, I wonder what role there is within that sort of African ethic that you've articulated, as well as when we think about this question of personhood. I mean, canonically in the West, obviously for Kant, these two things come together so very tightly. So if you could talk maybe about how you see the interaction between those terms, one, the relational constitution of the person, and then two, this question of autonomy as it relates to the kind of disability ethic that you're putting forward. So yeah, I'll leave it there. And I think it comes into, as I point ahead to you, Joel, I think it does come into this question of a phenomenology of ability as it relates to autonomy. So I guess that's the way I would tie these thematically together.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon, for that very interesting and thoughtful question. Perhaps I'll respond by saying that my starting point is from African philosophy, and from African philosophy, the emphasis on things like autonomy, capacity are not at the core of how you understand the individual or how the individual relates with others. So it's the emphasis is more about in some ways interdependence. So it's a kind of insufficiency of the individual that is sort of stressed, and therein lies the question of obligations is tied to that. So it's almost like it's almost Aristotelian in some sense, that to be a good person, you have to give primacy to care for others in one sense, but also to help them in their times of need and distress. And that is in some ways how the notion of community is built. But because of the emphasis on some kind of the emphasis on virtue and character, it does sort of imply that there is some sense of autonomy required for individuals to be able to act in certain ways, even to assist others. And this is sort of my problem, that it sort of the community becomes one in which mutual obligations are sort of the dominant way of relating to each other. And it doesn't say much about those that cannot reciprocate the obligations to others, what happens to them within that sort of understanding of community. And what I'm trying to do in my work is to try and show that obligations are not necessarily symmetrical. It's not always mutual, but there are certain members of a community that will be dependent on the assistance of others. So it sort of goes against the grain of maybe much of disability studies and disability justice that starts with the emphasis on rights and carries that forwards in the African tradition is obligations. And it's not that rights are not present, but they're not the most important thing when you're talking about community. I don't know if that sort of answers part of what you're asking. Yeah. Right.
Perhaps I might then, since we're on your paper, might bring in my own, because I think this is tied in very much to that, right? Because you make the point, right? Very familiar in African philosophy, right? This question of obligation and responsibility leads to personhood. And the implication would be, right, that if the person isn't capable of carrying out their obligations, they're less of a person. And I think you help overcome this, right? Precisely because, and I think this comes from that sort of, we might say, decolonizing tendency, right? That reciprocity need not be reciprocal in the simple sense, right? That is to say, if we look at, and here I look at anthropology, right? There's a lot of tribes that engage in asymmetrical reciprocity precisely because of that. And what I would say is, one of the things you didn't, I think, mention, and I would have liked to hear more, is about like sort of communal social roles. Because in the West, it's social roles are oppressive, right? We don't want to be stuck in them. But social roles lead to duties, right? Elder people, for example, can't care for themselves anymore, so we take care of them, right? And I think what I found very interesting, actually, and this is sort of where I want to push you forward on, is you use taxes. And I think taxes, I haven't heard anyone argue in favor of taxes, especially in the Anglo-American world. And I think that's a very good, interesting way of, I mean, especially in our modern world, right, of reframing things, because what I would say is the image of taxes is external. I am extracting this from you, and this is tied to kings and rulers who are distant. But if we look at communities, you can think of it less as a tax and more as a tithe, right, in lieu of service, right? And I think when you look at it in that way, this changes perspective. And so I want to sort of push you further on this question of sort of differentiating taxes and tithes, and how I think, because this is the thing, even a tax is transactional, right? What would be a tax that isn't just a simple, like, I extract from you individual look like, right? And so that's what I definitely would like to hear more about that.
Okay, no, that's really quite it's a very thoughtful comment, and also an interesting question. It's in some ways it's part of the aspect of my work that I'm struggling with at the moment because of my use of taxes. But here's why I use it. First of all, I take seriously the literature in African philosophy on obligation saying that they are binding on each individual. They are not, as Kwame Diakia, the African philosopher, suggests, that they're not voluntary commit. Each individual has that it's binding on them. But that sort of depiction of obligations might work in a small scale sort of traditional historical setting. How does it work if we want to make sense of them in the modern nation states? There was at least one attempt to do that, and that's in the African Charter of Human and People's Rights, but it doesn't capture the core of what the obligations entail, especially the ethical and compassionate dimensions. Indeed, when you look at the obligations in the Charter, they do seem like social roles rather than ethical commitments between people. And therefore, if you like, to implement or to achieve that notion of obligations, it needs something of a, and that's perhaps why tax was attractive, something like a placeholder, something to collectivize individual obligations and in some way make it binding, in some ways that people discharge them to those they need. And therefore tax sort of, for me, in spite of its limitations, in spite of, as you've suggested, even its origins in colonial rule, being a very dark instrument on the part of the empire to further their colonial aims. Yeah, I'm suggesting that it can be decolonized, and in some ways, and I find that distinction you make between taxes and tithes interesting, because you see some of that empirically in religious institutions in Africa, whether it's the evangelical church or the mosque. The idea of sort of Islamic kind of tithes, and they use it to help those in need. And that is what I'm in some ways trying to see, whether tax, whether through some kind of scheme, whether it's a hypotheticated tax scheme, you can have a special kind of tax for the most vulnerable in society, like people with disabilities, in different African societies. But it's, like I said, it's quite a difficult argument to make with the because of the negative connotation of tax itself.
Yeah, so that's all very interesting. I want to maybe redirect a little bit over to Joel. And one of the pieces that I thought was really interesting, I mean, you made a pretty strident and vague statement that that the understanding of the I can, the understanding of ability and capability, that's sort of underpinned much of the Western intellectual tradition, as you called it, has been, indefensible on its face, or if it were interrogated, it would be understood to be deeply indefensible. So I was wondering if you could sort of lay out a little bit more about this question of the sort of ontological or phenomenological insufficiency related to that, and then sort of what it points toward when we think about both lives worth living and the questions of justice that have been raised by Oche.
Yeah, great question. And I'll see if I can also tie my response back a bit to some of Oche's work and also some of the discussion we were just having. Don't know if I'll be able to do that, but let's see what happens here. Well, let me, just for the sake of a somewhat succinct answer, let me limit myself to kind of, let's go, 15th century forward. Descartes, Spinoza, et cetera, that crew kind of forward. One of the, I think, historical, let's go with, peculiarities of that tradition is the way in which there's a response to a certain version of Christianity that's dominating throughout the quote unquote Middle Ages forward. A response to that on the one hand wants to hold on to certain aspects of a basic Judeo-Christian picture of the world, and on the other hand is thinking much more mechanistically. This is the origins of what we think of as quote unquote modern science, and there's this tension between a very ancient vision of the individual, vision of the role of religion / government, not that those can necessarily ever be disentangled, much less at that time or even now. This is present at the same time that there's a type of empiricism and a turn towards more naturalistic explanations really taking over. Like, Joel, why do you have to go that far to answer this question? I swear this will come together in like just a second. That moment, does that tension, I don't think stops. Whether we look to Hume, whether we look to, we can go all the way up to Kant. I think that tension is as palpable as ever. Maybe it's even made the most extreme in Kant, who of course is trying to retain explicitly a Judeo-Christian kind of vision of the world, but one that does not necessarily require religious faith in the way that he thought of it. All of that whole pocket of work and that pocket of traditions sees individuals as units. Spinoza is, we have to bracket Spinoza, obviously, so ignore Spinoza, but sees individuals more or less as units that are part of larger systems, and these are units that can be added or taken away from. There are qualities that make you more what it is to be human or make you less. And this is true of how all of the thinkers I just mentioned, again, setting Spinoza to the side, this is true of not simply their explicit statements about disability in general, but it's especially true of any time they mention intellectual disability, which often will go under terms that were, like fool or something that was more used at the time, and fill in the blank for other languages, French, Latin, you name it. Okay, here's the payoff for that terrible dragging people through the history of a particular pocket of philosophy. That whole story is also inextricable from the history of colonialism and the creation of the concept of race. The way I was trained back in the day, that wasn't told, right? We didn't mention that all of these thinkers, especially someone like John Locke, Kant is certainly on the list here, these were some of the leading thinkers for creating a framework that justified and would continue to justify colonialism. If you can say that people can be lacking in certain ways, what have you done? You have introduced the concept of the subhuman. You've created dehumanization from the get-go. And we know from modern research on dehumanization, I'm thinking of people like David Livingstone Smith, the moment you allow that someone can be slightly less than human, you have now opened the door to the primary psychological mechanism behind everything from acts of senseless interpersonal violence to genocides. That is the key that unlocks it. And this tradition, again, there's quotation marks, right? The line from the Greeks to whoever you pick, the Middle Ages, to everything I just told you, Descartes, Kant forward. This is also a racist construction by Germans in the 19th century. Anyway, set that to the side. But here would be the really provocative way to put it. The creation of the concept of disability as we use it in modern times, 17th, 18th century forward, I think is unthinkable without the history of the creation of the concept of race and the promulgation of colonial thinking and colonial rule across the globe. And if we cannot, among other things, quash, like completely extinguish this idea that humans can be lacking in humanity, whether that's with respect to how we think about their abilities, with respect to how they are racialized, with respect to their role in whatever, if we can't quash that, we'll never get anywhere near the sort of justice that I will just assume we would all want, or at a minimum get closer to some sort of equity across all sorts of differences. That was not succinct, but I think I tied it back to the former comment. So, all right, I got 1 out of 2 goals there for the. Yeah.
Well, let me try one that will complement that one, and I think we'll try to tie both you, Oche, and Joel together in an even deeper way, right? So,
Nice.
You read it from race, and I think you're absolutely right. But in my mind, I had this little Nietzsche itch in the back of my brain where I was thinking, what unites, this perspective? And you notice it's this fear of the body. And I identify it as almost the story you're telling is it's philosophy has always had this issue because it's aristocratic, right? And aristocracy depends, even prior to racialization, on we are the valuable, you're the not valuable. Your lives are less worthwhile than ours. We're scared of disease, right? When COVID happened, what happened? Same thing that happened in the Renaissance with the Black Plague. The rich people leave the cities, right? The poor people are left to die. They live there with their rats, right? There's this fear of the body and the fear of mortality, and I think this inherent elitism and the way to tie it together, I think, especially with today and your 2 papers, is I think this sort of thinking is more important because we've seen this resurgence of eugenicist thinking in the ultra rich today, and it comes from the global north. So there's the racialized element, right? Some people are worth less than others. And, I think you mentioned in your abstract, right, eugenics in terms of making sure some people don't, right? We have this schizophrenia right now in the United States. We need more Americans, but also the world's overpopulated, right? And I think this is the problem of the global north in general. And I think you can very easily tie this into this question of, disability, whether via IQ or otherwise. But I mean, this is what you're seeing with Peter Thiel, right? Your Elon Musk's, right? They think they're superior. They need to have 20 children. You should have no children, right? And I think this is tied into this broader, I think, global, or I would like to suggest, right, that this model of disability that you're both sort of talking about is precisely premised on this individualistic elitism that is fundamentally opposed to things like community, right? Fundamentally opposed to caregiving together, right? And I think perhaps this might tie it together. I don't know. This is just me sort of nudging a little bit. Let me know what you think.
You want to go first or me? Yeah, so that's great. And I do think you're right. There is a very good reason to take it one step further and say, actually, this is always just about power. Like the ultimate explanatory thing here is power between social groups. Yeah, let me add one thing, which is the resurgence of eugenicist thinking, very explicit eugenicist thinking you mentioned Peter Thiel, the Elon Musk of the world, you name it. The fact that this is happening as as the general public is increasingly aware of the continually impending destructions of climate change, which were caused primarily by corporate elites and a very small subset of companies, but which have made lots of people unbelievably rich. I think we should take that as a sign of the fight that is to come, right? This is a cycle we should have seen coming if we remember the first rise of the modern form of eugenics in the United States and Britain, that then the Nazis, of course, were like, hey, y'all are doing this really well. Let's just take your blueprint and add a few extra things in there. Like, it's going to be a very, very serious battle to fight against those who are going to use all of the mechanisms, all of the power of the state to make sure that it's the richest who not only stay protected as the world gets increasingly dangerous due to climate changes, but as things get far more volatile, whether it's with regards to migration patterns or you name it. And this time, you know, we'll see if it's a world war or whatever it might be, but we're in a moment, I think, right before a very, very big storm, literally and metaphorically. I say as I just got a tornado watch for where I live, so yeah.
I don't think I can add too much to that. Both your comments, I pretty much agree with both of them, and I find that connection that Joe was raising about colonialism, race, and disability quite interesting. I've actually come across some work on that, the way in which especially Africans were defined as lacking in a specific kind of way, and you can see parallels with the way in which we think about disability. I just wanted to throw in a question to Joel, if that's possible. I just, since you talked about pain and suffering, well, first of all, let me say I find your book, I look forward to reading it. I find the ideas you've outlined quite fascinating. But I was wondering if there's anything in there about Simone Weil, who wrote a lot about pain and suffering, and whether, I know she didn't write about disability, but whether there are any connections between her work and how we think about disability as well.
Thank you for that question. So that was a gap in my knowledge base when I was writing this book, but I can tell you happily that there will be engagement with Weil in the next book, which in some ways is quite more or less literally a sequel. The Meaning of Disability. It's under contract with Oxford, and of course my editor keeps checking in saying, when are you going to send this to me? And I do what we all do and say, soon. But that will be in there. And The Life Worth Living, it didn't, for lots of reasons I won't go into, I didn't do a lot of analysis that was taking explicitly into consideration questions of racialization, like a lot of the stuff we're talking about is not actually in that. And also a lot of figures who I should have engaged with, and Weil is among them, are not in there. And so I'm going to do my very best to rectify that in the forthcoming book. Date to be announced.
So it looks like we're about out of time, but we got a few more minutes if people are okay with it, to ask, you know, if anybody has a final question or sort of anything they'd like to make as a sort of final comment. I think we can sort of set aside a few final minutes for that if people have something.
I'd love to ask Oche a question back, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely.
A good chunk of my work is explicitly in relationship to bioethics these days, and public health and whatnot. And I'm curious, you know, taking the research that you have already done and the ways in which you have pushed forward debates that are thinking of disability justice in a more capacious manner, drawing from African traditions and others. what is your sense of the future of disability justice? And I won't say across the globe because that's like too much, but in the kind of spaces that you're thinking about, like, what do you hope especially might happen, and hope where things will go, whether conceptually or on the ground in the next, say, 10 or 20 years? I would be very curious to know your thoughts.
Did it? Yeah. Thanks, Joe. I thinking about the future of disability justice and sort of my research, where it's going, or where those ideas. I think, I mean, in parallel to research, I see a lot of affinities that I wasn't aware about when I began looking at African philosophy, especially sort of with other relational traditions, whether it's a feminist tradition, and I think they have a lot in common. So it's sort of building those commonalities, if we're looking at it on a global, from a global perspective, to say that we're all in some ways talking about the same kind of issues and the connections we have, because the African humanist tradition is not, it's, and this might sound quite odd, it's communitarian, but it's quite cosmopolitan. It's not talking about the individual on, if you like, an ethnic basis or on the basis of gender. It's talking about humans, but it's also not just talking about humans, it's talking about living beings in the world. So it's finding ways in which we can understand disability justice from those various perspectives. And I think that herein lies, that's what I think of the future of disability justice, in a way without rights and the obstacles that rights present. Not that rights are not a good thing, but I think there are other ways thinking about disability justice that we still remain to be explored, if that answers the question.
Yeah, it's super exciting and makes me very excited for your next book.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody, I think that might be it for us today. Thank you so much for this, I think, really provocative and interesting discussion. I think it's left me with a lot to think about. I think hopefully we can continue this discussion. And again, thank you both so much. Very exciting and interesting talks. And I look forward at least to reading your book, Joel. Thanks, everybody.